Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 5th of August, 2016, a little bit after 1 o'clock, I'm afraid. We just had some technical difficulties there, but very pleased to say back online. I will be joined in a few moments by David Scott with Northern Exposure. Weather a bit on the gloomy side here in Plymouth, and that seems to be the report from across other parts of UK, although Holland is apparently sunny. Well, where do we start today? We think the right place to start is with the resignation of Justice Goddard, chair of the child abuse inquiry. Was that inquiry real? We don't believe so. But we also think it's remarkable that Justice Goddard has resigned within a few days of that very brave police whistleblower exposing exactly what has been happening to cover up the abuse of children with actions by politicians, police, local authorities, children's services and charities. So I'll just remind people, here is the UK column front page with the Dispatch's interview. If you haven't heard this interview, you need to hear it, because this man has literally put his life at risk to speak out about the engine which is driving British politics, and that engine is child abuse. We've got an open letter to the policing minister, Mr. Lewis, is featured there, centre screen. We have had no response from this gentleman at all, no response, no interest to the fact that Metropolitan Police officers are putting their lives on the line to reveal the cover-up of child abuse. So there we are, the lady has stepped down, and as we're going to see and discuss with David Scott, there has been an extraordinary exchange of letters, and already people are asking what is it the exact truth about this lady. So here is one of her better statements. She said that she's found the job a bit of a struggle, and she's missed her beloved family in New Zealand. So this is yet another chairman who has resigned from the child abuse inquiry, and we're led to believe that this supposedly highly intelligent judge didn't really know what she was getting into. She didn't really understand the law in UK. It was all a little bit of a struggle on a mere £360,000 a year plus 110,000 allowances. And she's going to spend a bit more time with her family. She said that she thought long and hard before taking on the crucial role, and this included careful top-level talks with senior legal and political officials, both in Britain and New Zealand. Well, of course, the only thing is that the British public certainly weren't told what was discussed in those closed-door discussions. Was it how tight her terms of reference was? Was it the sensitive issues that she shouldn't go near? We don't know, because everything about this inquiry has been secretive. And at this point, we better bring in the new Home Secretary, Amber Rudd. She says, "I know that this will have been a difficult decision for you to make and something you will have carefully considered. I was sorry to receive your letter, but I accept your decision." Now, we will be having a look at the letters in a minute because they're really extraordinary. But before we move on to Theresa May and her role in this sad affair, David, let's bring you in. What is your feeling about the sudden resignation of Justice Goddard?
My initial reaction was one of actually I laughed because it was so desperate. It was so such a failure to investigate, such a failure to satisfy the demands for justice in this country, and such a transparent attempt to cover up what was going on with the previous two appointments to that post, to have within a year this lead of the inquiry throwing up her hands and saying life is too difficult. It's almost funny. It's ridiculous is what it is. Surely she knew when she took this on what she was taking on. She was taking on a life-defining challenge. If it's not a life-defining challenge, what is she there for? What does she think she's doing? And yet, after a year, she's off. I'm convinced we're not being told anything like the whole story here, Brian. I think there's much, much more to discover, and hopefully we will.
Well, I completely agree with that. As we're going to see, there are other people saying there's something that smells about this whole affair. But I'd like to just bring in Theresa May, because, of course, she had the authority as Home Secretary, and now she's got extra authority as the Prime Minister. And this quote was pointed out to us, and I'll give you the significance in a minute, but she said, "When I stood in Downing Street as Prime Minister for the first time last month, I said I believe in a country that works for everyone, whoever we are and wherever we're from," to which I've added, except child abuse victims, of course. So this lady was the lady who had all of the dirty dealings of setting up this inquiry. They claimed it was independent. UK column proved that wasn't, and we'll recap on a bit of that. But I'd like to thank our viewer who emailed in to highlight the fact that Theresa May had been standing up for the gay community, but she simply doesn't want to stand up and tell the truth about people who are abusing children. So we've got to ask ourselves, why the split personality when it comes to the abuse of children? Why? Well, I think the answer is becoming increasingly clear that child abuse is the means by which politicians and senior members of the government are blackmailed in order to carry out the agenda of other malicious persons. And we now know for a fact, due to the testimony of our Met Police man, and indeed other policemen and women, that senior levels of the police, including the Met Police, have been instrumental in that cover-up of the abuse. So if we just remind ourselves of what Ms. Goddard was supposed to do, she said her terms of reference were to consider the extent to which state and non-state institutions have failed in their duty of care to protect children from sexual abuse and exploitation in England and Wales. Now, what is interesting about this, of course, is that when you actually analyse what her inquiry was supposed to do, it was described as a probe. It was described as a little bit of a discussion, because apparently there's been some naughty people abusing children, and it's important that we see what mistakes were made, and we learn from those mistakes and we move on. What of course the inquiry was not and is not is a proper criminal investigation. So was it to achieve a Chilcot type result, millions of words and no tangible action, or is it something deeper than that? David, I have never believed that this inquiry was designed to do anything to bring child abusers to book. I have always believed that this was to bury the truth as deep as possible to protect the government. Is that view too cynical for you, or can you add to it?
No, it's exactly the view we had of the Scottish inquiry when it was set up, because we saw the terms of reference. They were far too narrow. It was doomed to failure. And in Scotland, it appears that the people they appointed would not countenance that failure and would not put up with the controlling hand of the Scottish state. And therefore, they felt they had to resign, and they did so with immediate effect. We had the two previous people in the English post who resigned did so immediately because they had lost the confidence of the victims and survivors. Which is the case here? Has Justice Goddard lost the confidence of the victims and survivors, or is there some crisis perhaps to do with government interference that has prompted this, with immediate effect, resignation?
Well, David, the possibility of government interference, as of course has been mentioned north of the border, and we'll come on to that in a minute. But you kindly pointed us at her actual resignation statement, which we'll bring up on screen. People can find this by Googling it quite easily. We've taken this edition from New Zealand Newswire, but it's readily available in other places. I will do my best to read it. I'm struggling a little bit here because part of the text is small for me as well. Let's see what we can do. She said, I announce with regret my decision to resign as chair of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, effective from today. When I was first approached through the British High Commission in Wellington in late 2014 and asked to consider taking up the role, I had to think long and hard about it. After carefully discussing the matter with the Home Secretary and her officials and seeking the counsel of those people in New Zealand whose opinion mattered to me, I decided that I should undertake the role given my relevant experience and track record in the area. It was, however, an incredibly difficult step to take, as it meant relinquishing my career in New Zealand and leaving behind my beloved family. The conduct of any public inquiry is not an easy task, let alone one of the magnitude of this. Compounding the many difficulties was its legacy of failure, which has been very hard to shake off, and with hindsight it would have been better to have started completely afresh. While it has been a struggle in many respects, I'm confident there have been achievements and some very real gains for victims and survivors of institutional child sexual abuse in getting their voices heard. I have nothing but the greatest respect for the victims and survivors and have particularly enjoyed working with the Victims and Survivors Consultative Panel, which I established. So there we are. She says she considered it very carefully in the beginning. She felt she was well qualified to take the job. She then arrives in UK. She swallows roughly £500,000. Then she decides she doesn't really understand the English law. She needs a bit of help. And all of a sudden, she is gone. Well, David, you pointed us at the letters which are available on gov.uk site. Here they are. And what an extraordinary exchange this is, because this is her resignation letter. And the first thing to note is that we are to believe this is real, this letter. But the header, this is not to do with our presentation of the letter, the header is crooked. And I believe, since I have some original documentation addressed to me in person from the inquiry, I know that the header on their normal printed paper is certainly not crooked. I believe that this letter has been tampered with in some way. But let's have a look at how she resigns. It's quite extraordinary. She says, "Dear Home Secretary, I regret to advise that I'm offering you my resignation as chair of the Independent Inquiry into Institutional Child Sexual Abuse with immediate effect. I trust you will accept this decision." And David, this is extraordinary because apparently she was on a 3-month, she had to give 3 months notice with regard to her contract. So she's breached her contract. I wonder whether she'll be handing back the £500,000 that would appear to have gone into her purse.
It is an extremely remarkable resignation letter. I mean, here we have someone who is a major public figure running the most important public inquiry, I would suggest, that there has ever been in this country. And she resigns like that, with no explanation, with no reason, with no statement to the public as to what is going on. Now, this point about, oh, she was unfamiliar with English law, 2 points on that. One, New Zealand, like Scotland, like America, is a common law jurisdiction. And that's the only law you really need to be familiar with in order to understand how things operate in England. And when you're dealing with the rape and murder of children, this is something that is that people know instinctively and inherently is wrong. You don't need a great deal of subtlety to in you know, the details of a particular legal jurisdiction in order to make a stand on those grounds. So I don't accept that the English law was a problem here. You're dealing with human beings who have been abused, and you're dealing with the truth. And these are things which are not specific to any one legal system. I'm astounded. I really am. I'm astounded not only that it's happened, but how it's happened, how it's been handled. It seems so amateurish and so hasty. I don't know quite what else to say about that, other than we are clearly not seeing the truth here. We're clearly not getting the whole story.
That's certainly the opinion of the UK column. The truth is somewhere at the bottom of a deep pit. We've got some comment others have made, but let's see first of all what the Home Secretary said in response to that resignation letter. So here is the reply. It says, Dear Dame Lowell, thank you for your letter today offering your resignation of chair of the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse. I know that this will have been a difficult decision for you to make and something you will have carefully considered. I was very sorry to receive your letter, but I accept your decision. We all recognise that the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse is the most ambitious public inquiry ever established in England and Wales. Under your leadership, the inquiry has already instituted and made progress on each of the core projects, the research project, the truth project, and the public hearing project. I'm grateful to you for bringing your experience to bear in devising how the inquiry will operate, guided by its three fundamental principles: that it will be comprehensive, inclusive, and thorough. I know how personally committed you have been to ensuring that the inquiry is a success to those at its heart, the survivors and the victims. You have consistently demonstrated your desire to leave no stone unturned in order that the voices of those victims might be heard. It is a testament to your commitment that you have taken the difficult decision to stand down, having set the inquiry firmly on course, and allow someone else to lead it through to the end. With regret, I agree that this is the right decision. I will know that you will want to be reassured that work continues without delay, and most importantly, the victims and survivors know the government's commitment to this inquiry is undiminished. I want to be absolutely clear. The success of this inquiry remains an absolute priority for the government. I'm determined to keep the process on track, and I'm taking immediate steps to appoint a new chair as soon as possible. I will, of course, consult with victims and survivors groups before making a public announcement about the appointment. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for your commitment to the inquiry over the course of the last 16 months. Your hard work will have a lasting impact on the inquiry and ultimately in getting to the truth about the institutional response to child sexual abuse in this country. Of that you can take pride. With my thanks and very best wishes for your future endeavours. This to me reads like a sort of low-grade manager letter to somebody who's resigned from a fairly basic position in an average small company. It's overstated, glowing praise, which is inappropriate. This letter, I think, is nearly as extraordinary as Goddard's resignation letter, David.
Yes, and look what she says. She says that she agrees that Goddard's got to go, but no reasons are given, no valid reason. In fact, in that letter, no reason at all is given for why Goddard has to go. So why does she have to go? If she's so good and she's been so good in establishing the inquiry, why does she have to go? And go with immediate effect, no 3-month notice period as per her contract, no, with immediate effect. If she just felt that she was worn out by it and she couldn't cope, would she not work her notice period? So one of several things is clearly happening here. I would question what legal pressure has been brought to bear by the alleged perpetrators on the inquiry. I would question what political pressure has been brought to bear by the friends of the alleged perpetrators on the inquiry.
David, as you're saying that, sorry to interject, as you're saying that, let's help that process along, because you were keen to remind our viewers and listeners today of the resignation in Scotland of of Ms. O'Brien. Here she is with her colleague, Professor Lamb, who also resigned. And of course, what she said is she could no longer carry on chairing the independent Scottish child abuse inquiry because of government interference. So when you're stating what you are, of course, you are doing so where another professional who was supposedly running one of these inquiries said, I can't do my job because the Scottish government continues to interfere.
Well, this is it, and that was a very, very strongly worded, very frank statement as to what the problem is in Scotland. And the problem is, of course, the Scottish government. What's the problem in England and Wales? We don't know, because no one will say. But that's the essential information that you need to have.
David, I wonder whether this lady, even if we say she was brought in order to do a fairly delicate job for the government of getting some of the truth to the surface, but keeping a lid on what was really happening, she's leaving it, to me, in a big hurry. And normally when people do that, they've been warned off, they've been frightened. She's mentioning her beloved family. I just wonder whether somebody has actually threatened her. We know from whistleblowers in the police, whether it's in the Metropolitan Police or other police forces around the country, that when people start to dig into this very high-level child abuse, the threats start. Could it be that Justice Goddard has actually had somebody whisper in her ear that, well, you're okay, dear, but we're not so sure about your family?
Well, it's distinctly possible. And again, we need to know why the haste, why the undue haste. So yes, she could have been threatened. Another possible explanation is that the dam on this is about to burst, and she doesn't want to be in post when it happens. Indeed.
Now, you picked up on this tweet, I think it is, by Mr. Joshua Rosenberg. And the key bit down here, I'll let you explain it, but I'll just bring in the arrow. He says, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I think that a resignation letter, though printed on the inquiry team's letterhead, may have been drafted and typed for her by the Home Office. And he's picking up on the use of the letters QC. You were quite taken by this gentleman because he's a QC himself, so he should know what he's talking about, and he's smelling a rat.
Yes, and he's taking the view. Now, he's quite an insider. He works for the BBC. He's got 30 years' experience in legal matters. And he is somewhat of an establishment voice, but he's taking the view that she was forced out because the government did not think they were getting their money's worth in terms of reassuring the public. Now, the bottom line here is, if the public find out quickly what has actually been going on in Westminster and in the political establishment all around the country, including Scotland, then the likely outcome would be this country would be ungovernable by the people who currently govern it. I wouldn't be at all surprised if Westminster was burned to the ground, because the rage would be so intense, because what has been going on has been, that degree of severity. Now, if the government require that information to be stage managed in a certain way, and they don't think that she's doing the job, well, that would be an explanation as to why she had to go, because the government has decided you're out. So she's been fired, she's been pushed. And that's Mr. Rosenberg's take on it. She's been pushed. She's not really resigned at all.
Right. The issues you raise there, of course, are absolutely correct. What we are looking at is the distinct possibility now that by the scale of the child abuse, the fact that it's run through our political system, the highest levels of the civil service, and of course we've had the security services implicated in a number of cases, cover-ups, whether it's been in Northern Ireland or it's been around Westminster. So the security services, who should be bringing criminal activity to light, they've been burying it. we end up with the fact that the public learns for the first time that it's being governed by a criminal elite in Westminster who are prepared to cover up the abuse of children. And this means that, of course, they can be trusted on no policy whatsoever. Well, let's just have a look at this comment, which I picked up from the internet. I found it very interesting. It's from Kids for Cash, UK, and they say, did the Times run a cover-up operation after a tip-off on Goddard's resignation? Now, I don't fully understand the background of this, but I think it's connected to the fact that she should have given 3 months' notice. Something was brewing. We had little indications of that earlier in the week. But somebody here saying that the Times actually knew more, but they've been helping to smooth the waters. Do you know anything about this one, or should we just leave it for our audience to investigate?
No, I don't know anything about that particular one. I would point out one tweet that I did spot was from John Mann, the MP who has campaigned so bravely to bring the child sexual abuse scandal and the Westminster role in it to the public's attention and to give some degree of voice to the victims. He tweeted out that this is a disaster for the victims and survivors, and that the only appropriate course of action is to recall Parliament. I would comment simply that if we had a Parliament that was worthy of the name, then that is exactly what would happen. But I fear that there are far too few like John Mann who actually care.
Well, that does seem to be true, David. And of course, we haven't had any response from the previous policing minister or the present incumbent. So despite open letters to Mr. Lewis asking what he was going to do to protect the police whistleblower, a stony silence. But you did pick up on this lady, Barbara Hewson, because she has been speaking out for quite a while, saying that everything to do with the abuse is complete nonsense, that there are no nasty people in high places. But you picked up on a couple of her tweets. I'll see if I can read this one out. It says, "Oh dear, CSA conspiraloons don't know what to do now Goddard has resigned. Maybe this shows just how toxic their obsession with the past is." We had this one, BBC News, Dame Lowell, Goddard resigns, letter in full. According to Hewson, this means the so-called inquiry is a total waste of time. She's happy to forward that one on. And then we've got reality is inquiry was based on a moral panic whipped by opportunist survivor groups and ambulance chasing lawyers. So this lady is very interesting in her vociferous support for those poor people who've been accused of abuse.
Yes, she's a very interesting lady in lots of ways, with very interesting links and very interesting beliefs. We'll maybe come back and look at more on that later. But the point that's really worth taking away from that is here you have a professional opponent of the victims and survivors of child sexual abuse, a professional apologist for the perpetrators of child sexual abuse. And what is she saying? She's saying, oh, that the inquiry is in disarray because there's nothing there. And in fact, the truth is the inquiry is in disarray because there is so much there that the level of evidence is overwhelming. The best explanation seems to be it is overwhelmed in one way or another, Ms. Goddard. And it's certainly not an absence of evidence and an absence of cases to answer that is afflicting this inquiry.
Yeah. Well, we're going to finish on this particular subject, but just to sort of wrap up and give people a feel for this case, this was part of the video that the inquiry released, advertising itself, advertising Miss Goddard and the good work they were going to do. It said this is a statutory inquiry which is entirely independent of the government. Now remember, in the letter we've just heard from the Home Secretary, she also said it was independent. But we pointed out that a senior gentleman from the Home Office John O'Brien, Home Office Director for Safeguarding, he said that the Child Sexual Abuse Inquiry Liaison Team sit within the Safeguarding Directorate within the Home Office, is currently led by Helen Griffiths and Cheryl Mendes. The team is there to support the Home Secretary in the process of appointing a chairman, ensuring that she's taken on the views of survivors in doing so. The team is also the link between the Home Office and the inquiry. So we just simply pointed out that if you looked at what was being presented as independent, it absolutely wasn't. The inquiry was fully embedded in the Home Office, controlled by the Home Office, and this makes it much easier to see that Ms. Goddard can well have been just sacked by the Home Office, maybe for being too diligent. We put this in another diagrammatic form here, highlighting the case of Melanie Shaw, never interviewed, of course, by Justice Goddard, but then after 16 months, nobody has been interviewed by Justice Goddard. But what we pointed out is that Goddard was buried in a ring of steel. She had Home Secretary staff around her. She then had an outer layer, which included the Met Police. We've heard from the Met, the whistleblower, what they get up to. But also, of course, all of the call centre was being run by NSPCC staff working in partnership with the police. And many of the victims have said that they believe that paedophiles exist within NSPCC as well. So this was a very, very toxic situation. Contrast it with statements by Peter Wanless from the NSPCC. He says the NSPCC runs many services throughout the UK to help children who've been abused. However, we suspect there are still more than 50,000 victims who have no access to therapy. What he's really saying is there are at least 50,000 victims, but surprisingly, the police and NSPCC and the Home Office can't actually deal with this problem. This, I'm really lost for words, David. This is outrageous what is going on here. I wonder what nations overseas think as this starts to unfold. What would people in Syria be thinking about the British government that stands on a world stage and lectures them about how to run their country, or Libya or Somalia or Iraq or Afghanistan? This is truly disgusting.
Yes, I mean, they will think what hypocrites these people are, and they will wonder, they will look at us, the people of this country, and wonder why we tolerate being ruled by people of this quality.
Why do we tolerate it? This is true. Well, let us leave Goddard, but we're going to stick with the theme because, of course, this is also coming to light north of the border. One of the major cases at the moment is the Doherty case. Now, you're pointing out that 5 children have died as a result of a failure of the named person scheme, if I've got this right.
Right, which is not maybe quite how I would put it, but five children died under the, quote, care of a named person. Now, this was quite striking because it's actually a far larger number than you would expect. It looks like a spike, an upward spike in child deaths. But when this came to the public attention, and particularly the Liam Fee case in Fife, then the story we were getting from the Scottish Government changed quite dramatically. We have here from John Swinney, he says, they now admitted that, quote, a number of authorities have been making progress towards some form of named person scheme. But the type of capacity and capability of the named person as envisaged in our legislation is not in place, end quote. So he was suddenly saying, well, all these schemes that are running, they're not really the named person, so they're failures, and all these dead children you can't put at the door of the named person. But this was completely in contrast to what had been said for the previous year, including in Parliament, where these named person trials were held up by politicians, including Mrs. Swinney, as evidence that the named person scheme was working and was not only benign, but essential and helpful. So when the practice proved that those statements were false, then they simply ignored the previous statements and changed reality. So that's what we're facing here.
David, in this Express article, which we should be able to just pop up, we've got pretty black and white headline: exposed, why were children allowed to die? The shame of Sturgeon's named person policy. It's very interesting to see how this is now starting to be pulled apart by the press and media.
Yes, so there is that. You have to remember that for the 2 years previous to this, the spectre of dead children was used to sell the named person scheme. Anyone who opposed the named person scheme on the grounds that it's illiberal and an unnecessary intervention in family life by an overpowerful and underskilled state was told, you're putting lives. Actually, we had a government minister here go on national television and say that to oppose this scheme means you're putting children's lives at risk. That's what they said. They pointed at baby P and said, we're trying to stop this. Now, we then had those schemes going in, or the very closest approximation that the local authorities could make to the schemes, going in all around the country, and it manifestly has not worked. Now, there's no apology, there's no recognising of failure. There's nothing, there's just, we must press ahead, more of the same. That's what we get all of the time. There's an agenda at work, and reality is not allowed to derail the political agenda.
Okay, now we've got good news here, because of course the named person, no to named person initiative in Scotland has been producing some really good results. And this is from the website. And of course, the key bit is there's part of the judgment in the Supreme Court where the wise judges in this case said the first thing that a totalitarian regime tries to do is get at the children to distance them from the subversive varied influences of their families and indoctrinate them in their ruler's view of the world. Within limits, families must be left to bring up their children in their own way. This was a pretty powerful statement, and
for the Supreme Court to put that in that judgment is remarkable.
Okay, now I've got some of the other documents that have been circulating, so I know unfortunately you're not able to see what's coming up on screen, so I'll do my best to explain, and then we'll get some comment from you. But we've got Liberty here. This is Nicola Sturgeon. The Scottish Government will defend the Human Rights Act for all. If you weaken human rights protections, and this is contrary to how things are sometimes portrayed, you're not striking a blow at judges in Strasbourg, lawyers in London, or politicians in Scotland. You're striking instead at the poor, the vulnerable, and the dispossessed.
If I could comment on that as we go along. This is Liberty. Now, we covered this at the time. We covered the rampant hypocrisy of this at the time, because they were standing in a hall dedicated to a rent strike leader in Glasgow, and rent control was introduced on the basis of that, and that was the reason that the Glasgow, I remember, was a sea of rubble. But they were ignoring that, and were standing in this hall dedicated to the rent strike leader. And Nicola Sturgeon was making this speech, and she was applauded, lauded by Liberty. Here at last we have a politician who's standing up for truth and liberty. Now, this was at the time the named person scheme was going through. Did Liberty oppose it? No. Did Liberty even notice that it breached Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights? Apparently not. And since the Supreme Court have come back with that judgment, what has Liberty said? Nothing. Now, in that article, they say that they will be watching the Scottish Government to make sure that they're as good as their words. Well, they're not watching very carefully.
Okay, and am I right in saying this is the very same Liberty that Shami Chakrabarti has now been put forward to become a member of the Lords?
Yes, that was Liberty. At the time, Shami Chakrabarti was the leader of Liberty at that time. She was the one who was personally praising Nicola Sturgeon. It was, a girls' club, and they were praising one another. And, she's now got a seat in the Lords.
Okay,
So,
I might be able to pull a picture of her up in a minute. Now, you had some comments here from the Supreme Court itself. This was basically part of the judgment to appeal. Can you tell us about this one? The Supreme.
this is just to reiterate what the judgment actually was. The judgment is that the Article 4, Section 4 of the Children and Young People's Act is not compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. It breaches the right to family privacy, and private family life, and it is therefore out with the competency of the Scottish Government to pass any such legislation, which means it is stopped. The Scottish Government have to rewrite or remove the offending, defective piece of legislation. So it's just, there's been a lot of chit-chat north of the border, where we have ministers such as John Swinney standing up and saying, all this is just a technicality, it's just a tweak, and it's nothing of the sort. It's absolutely fundamental. Okay. And it is a real groundbreaking moment, and it's just worth pointing that out one more time.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, we have a Mr. Scott who's making comment. It gets confusing sometimes, the number of Scots there are in Scotland. So which Mr. Scott is this? SNP frontbenchers laughed at MSPs who raised concerns over the legality of the policy in June.
Well, this is a fair point, because many of the points that the Supreme Court found in favour of, found as sound arguments, were made in the Scottish Parliament to the derisive howls of laughter from the SNP benches, and indeed in many cases from the Labour and Liberal Democrat, goodness sake, Liberal Democrat benches as well. And what are these people doing? Are they making any apologies? Now, the Scot that you've got there, that might be, is that the piece from Tavish Scott? Yes, it is. Yes, that's from Tavish Scott, who is a Liberal Democrat MSP, and one of the better Liberal Democrat MSPs.
No, just sorry to interject. Just hold that slide, Theo. That's moving on. We just deal with Mr. Scott at the moment. That's yes. Okay.
So this is Tavish Scott. Now the Liberal Democrats asked for the Parliament to be recalled. Spot some similarities here. So we've had a groundbreaking decision by the Supreme Court that has ruled a piece of legislation passed, not quite unanimously, there were some abstentions, but passed by a huge majority by this Parliament, and it's been ruled to be unlawful. The Liberal Democrats ask for Parliament to be recalled to discuss this, and the very weak presiding officer, the equivalent of the Speaker, refused to do so. So we don't have a Parliament that's actually addressing the issues here. Just as in Westminster with the child sexual abuse scandal, I suspect there will be no recall of Parliament to discuss this. They will discuss war, they will discuss one or two other things in the summer holidays, but they will not discuss protecting our children.
Okay, and you mentioned Mr. Swinney a few moments ago, and we've got another piece of text here where it says John Swinney is discussing the next steps and making plans with senior figures, but there's only 38 days left to rewrite the legislation. And your point is they are not going to make it in that time scale. Is that correct?
Well, I don't think they'll make it in any time scale, because this is a completely fundamental failure on the part of the Scottish Government to appreciate that they've breached human rights. Now, remember, these are human rights. These are rights passed by a statute. These are rights given to us by government. So they've breached those rights. That's before you even get to the God-given inalienable rights, which are the rights to protect us from government. They've marched all over those a long time ago. Right. So the idea that this can be technically adjusted and put back in a few weeks or a few months, back into place and imposed on the Scottish people is ridiculous. It's now a completely toxic brand. Legalities aside, the people of Scotland will not accept this. Right? They realise it's been spotted for what it is, which is totalitarianism. That's why the Supreme Court put that clause in their judgment. It's totalitarianism. And I would point out that the SNP and Scottish Government response to this was, they only mentioned totalitarianism to explain Article 8, the background to Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. The Supreme Court have mentioned Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights 93 times in their findings. How many times have they mentioned totalitarian government in their findings, Brian? Once.
Okay.
Only once, and concerning the named person.
Okay, now, just to illustrate how things are going, this is a pretty hard headline, which is basically saying that the state snooper plan will be SNP's poll tax. So somebody's not messing around in this one.
Yes, and somebody's a very interesting gentleman, because it's Jim Sillars, who was former deputy leader of the Scottish National Party and memorably won govern from Labour when Labour viewed the Scottish electoral scene as their own personal fiefdom. So here we have somewhat of an elder statesman of the SNP, a man who has been committed his entire life to the politics of an independent Scotland, and he's looking at this and he's saying to his party, "You are mad. You have to be off your heads to be doing this. This will be a millstone."
Right.
And if you go ahead with it, you will make this an issue and a problem for the rest of this Parliament, and then be punished at the polls. It's your poll tax.
It's your poll tax.
And he's right. He's absolutely right.
Okay, and the other thing, of course, people are saying, pointing a finger at SNP, is that the nationalist agenda has just got out of control. And this article is suggesting that there's a big drive at the moment, if I've got this right, to get a 6 o'clock Scottish news going.
Yes. Now, this is a strange proxy fight. We've had this for years in Scotland. You wouldn't believe the number of column inches and arguments we've had in Scotland over whether or not we should have our own 6 o'clock news or share the one from London. Now, the point I'd like to raise with you here on this one is there's a journalist called David Torrance, and
we can just bring him up on screen. Actually, we've got an image of him. I'll bring this one and also this one here. So he's being reported in Herald Scotland.
Yes, so he's a journalist and columnist, and one of the more prominent and thoughtful and interesting journalists and operating in Scotland. He comments on the political scene extensively. He's had to leave Twitter, right? And he's said here why. He said, "Late on Tuesday night, I quit Twitter. And as I said in a valedictory tweet, it's no longer fun, and the personal abuse has begun to penetrate my relatively thick skin." Now, this arose because of the fact that he was not backing a Scottish 6 o'clock news, would you believe? But he comments here, "The usual bile flowed from the usual suspects. That I could cope with, but joining in the blatant misrepresentation of what I had said were a junior Scottish Government minister, a new backbencher, a councillor who works for the First Minister, and ironically the SNP's engagement strategist." So you're seeing here this kind of nasty, vindictive, bile-filled approach is coming from the very heart of the Scottish Government and is making ideas and viewpoints which do not comply with the party line very difficult to hold in Scotland. This is not a good thing.
No, indeed. Okay, well, we just end up on the gloomy subject of the state of the pound, and you've chosen this Telegraph report here, "Pound plunges, a Bank of England cuts interest rates." We are in for trouble, are we not?
Well, here we go. We've got an interest rate cut. We've got a momentous interest rate cut of 0.25%. Oh, do you remember where you were, Brian, when you heard about the 0.25% interest rate cut? Here you have Mark Carney going on and pretending, and it is pretending, that he's under some form of control of what is actually happening here. These people are not in control. There is runaway debt, there's a runaway state. There is no political will to bring either back into some sort of balance. Our country is becoming poorer and weaker as a result. It's just been covered up with money printing, and that will eventually be found out, and we'll have to deal with the reality that will then be facing us. And it's reality that will solve this. It is not the political or banking classes who are unable to address the reality of the situation because they believe in myths. They believe in Keynesian myths. They believe in the idea that you can have zero or negative interest rate policy and that will stimulate the economy. Despite how many years have we been trying this same policy? It's not working. They keep trying the same thing. It's not working. That's the definition of insanity, Brian.
Yeah, indeed. And we'll just let you comment on this one, your Mises weekends from the Mises Institute, very briefly.
So was that the one with...
James Grant. It's a Mr. James
Grant.
Grant.
Yes.
It's just an advert.
I just urge people to seek out this YouTube video on Did Anything Else by Jim Grant. Jim Grant runs a newsletter called Grant's Interest Rate Observer. It speaks extremely intelligently on matters financial. It observes the interest rates even when, as he points out, there are really no interest rates any longer to observe. He speaks from a consistently Austrian, sensible, rational school of thought, and he does not buy the Keynesian myths. It's a real joy to listen to him.
Okay, David, as always, thank you very much for joining us. Just in 10 seconds, what is your view as to what is actually going on in this country at the moment? United Kingdom, that is.
I'm trying to form that coherent view. There is a great deal of evil. There is a great deal of selling out. What there is not is the rule of law. The thing that's striking me most consistently in everything we do is nobody any longer seems to understand what law means, what truth means, and what justice means. We're seeing it in Police Scotland, we're seeing it in the political classes. And it's going to fall to the ordinary people of this country to demonstrate what these things are all about.
David, thank you very much for that. So we'll end today on if you are disturbed by what we've been reporting, particularly today, and I'm going to say you should be disturbed because this is the utter breakdown of proper law and order and democracy in this country. We need to do something about it. How do we do that? Tell the truth, expose it, and we need to restore the proper rule of law. And that, of course, is the exact name of the campaign which the British Constitution Group kick-started last weekend. So we can all help that process to bring back in the proper rule of law. And of course, common law and juries are a key part of that. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. If you would like one, we have now got our orders of UK Column T-shirts in the shop. You can see details of those on the UK Column website. If you like what we do and you're not yet a subscriber, please consider taking out a subscription. We still need your help, and particularly so if we're to expand and improve the reporting that we're doing. Alternatively, if you care to make a donation, that would be wonderful. So have a good weekend. Don't spend all of it thinking about the troubles of the country. Get out there and enjoy yourself with your families. But at the end of the day, we need many, many good people to do that little bit each day to expose what's actually happening in UK. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll be back on Monday. Bye-bye.